Metroid Prime is one of those games that grows on you, where the more you play it, the more you appreciate what it does. Most so-called professional reviews for newer games and media in general aren't worthwhile because they tend to offer a freshly experienced perspective. They only play the game once, and I think the best media is meant to be experienced over and again. This is why retrospective analysis exists, and why some media can be considered cult classics. Sometimes, when you look at something a second or third time, you notice new things, and that's a perspective that's missing when you only beat a game once. With Metroid Prime specifically, I think a common criticism is that the artifact hunt sucks, or that there's an excessive amount of backtracking, and these are issues that evaporate the more experienced you are with the game. Familiarity with the game's progression allows you to cut back on a significant amount of backtracking, which means the first playthrough revolves around exploration, and subsequent ones revolve around execution. Beyond that, you can get into sequence breaks and open up a whole new layer of depth. I can't experience Metroid Prime 1 for the first time again, so that sense of unfamiliarity and exploration can't be replicated. But I don't mind because I still love the progression and world design of the game, and these are aspects that I grew to respect more on subsequent runs. So if I played the game once and gave my review, it would be neglecting this facet of the game that I respect the most. I chose to play on normal difficulty because that's the most enjoyable way for me to play the game. The Wii version renamed easy mode to normal and normal mode to veteran, and the Switch version corrected this, so now normal mode is normal again. For a while when I was younger, I would play games on the hardest difficulty thinking that was the only way to fully appreciate the depth of a game's mechanics. But growing older, I stopped caring for some games. If a normal mode is balanced well enough, then that's good enough for me. And more specifically, Prime 1's normal mode is incredibly easy, but I don't think combat challenge is the point of the game. Doubling an enemy's health makes them take longer to kill, sure, but that just extends the length. It doesn't really make the game more challenging. The AI isn't improved, they don't gain new resistances that force you to change your playstyle. It just means these obstacles in your path take a little bit longer to blow up. Making enemies bullet sponges is one of my least favorite ways to increase difficulty. If you check out Ninja Gaiden 2, the bosses die in under a minute, but they can also kill you in seconds. It's a brutal game, one of the more challenging action games out there, but Ryu never once feels underpowered or weak. If all the hardest difficulty did was increase an enemy's health, it would undermine the point of the combat system. You're meant to use crowd control to ease the pressure. On Master Ninja, enemies go insane with projectiles, they're so much more aggressive. The spawn types also change so you fight more difficult enemies earlier on. And all of this forces you to take a more aggressive approach. Metroid Prime doesn't have this kind of radically different change between difficulty modes. Most games don't. I think my favorite example of difficulty selection comes from the first Valkyrie profile. The difficulty you choose doesn't affect the strength of the enemies or the damage you receive. It affects the dungeons you have access to and the characters you can recruit. There are dungeons on hard mode that you can't access on easy or normal, and there are dungeons on normal mode that you won't enter on hard. But because of this change, hard mode winds up easier than easy or normal, because you get access to dungeons that offer better experience and gear. And there are other little changes like characters join your party at level 1 on hard mode, you can't access the best ending on easy mode, and more. It's worth playing the game several times just to experience these changes. This portion on the space frigate is set up in a similar fashion to Super Metroid's intro, in that you progress through a linear area and are put on a timer to get out. I'm not really a fan of tutorials, but this portion of the game has a really satisfying payoff later on when you visit the crashed remains. That aside, if a game must have a forced tutorial, I prefer when you can blitz through them on a replay and just treat the section as an isolated sort of mini-level. Dark Souls 1 also does this with the Asylum, where you can just rush through the entire thing in a few minutes, but Demon Souls does it better, because you can just skip the tutorial segment after you beat the game. You also get a glimpse at Samus's expanded moveset here, which can be beneficial for newcomers to the series. You get a taste of how the game will open up. There's value in showing new players what they can expect from a game. Just having the game start on Talon 4 with nothing but your pea shooter might give players the impression that this is all the game has to offer. I kind of like when a game strips your powers. Castlevania Symphony of the Night uses a similar approach, but instead of stealing your abilities, Death steals your powerful equipment. What's really cool is that you can glitch the game to keep Alucard's gear, which is really only useful for speedrunning since Symphony of the Night is already easy enough. But again, I'm past the point where I'm looking for a brutal challenge from every game. Some games, yeah, I play for the challenge, but Castlevania and Metroid aren't those games. Metroid is pretty well known for its sequence breaks, and while you can sequence break Prime 1, it's pretty difficult to do when compared to the 2D entries. In the original North American GameCube version, you could get to the space jump boots in the starting area by doing what's called a scan dash, which was pretty easy to pull off. You stood on the ship, locked onto a distant object, then dashed to the right, and if you let go of your lock-on mid-dash, you accelerated very quickly, which lets you cover enough distance to make it to the space jump door. Retro fixed the physics for scan dashing pretty quickly for later printings of the game, and with this remastered version, I believe they added a new invisible wall to make it even more difficult. It's still possible to sequence break the game this way, but it requires a lot of practice to get the inputs down, and more importantly, I don't really enjoy sequence breaking in Prime. I prefer going through the intended progression. I think the game flows a lot better that way. But it's definitely nice to have the option to sequence break since it essentially allows you to remix the game. In Super Metroid, sequence breaking is so extreme that you can tackle any of the 4 major bosses in any order. That game doesn't have a difficulty setting, so the order you fight the bosses in can be your version of a difficulty selection. This boss isn't all that exciting, but it teaches you about the enemy radar. The tutorial segment in the Space Frigate doesn't really teach you about this in a practical way. Here, the enemies circle around you faster than you can keep track of them, and it doesn't really make sense to spin in place the entire time. What you can do is keep your eye on the radar and notice when they stop, then pivot to shoot the enemy. Because the game is in first person, Retro needed a way for you to keep track of off-screen enemies and stage hazards, which is what the radar and threat assessment gauge are for. I don't think the threat assessment gauge is that practical. It's no more useful than just paying attention to where you're moving, but the enemy radar comes in handy during several fights, especially when you're fighting the Chozo Ghost until you get the X-ray visor. I made a video calling Sin and Punishment 2 the greatest shooter I've played, yet I hold Metroid Prime in much higher regard despite the shooting being considerably worse. Am I contradicting myself? Probably, but my feelings about things are always changing, and I don't think of Metroid Prime as a shooter. It has shooting in it, shooting is how combat is handled, it's technically a shooter if we're trying to organize it by genre, but it's not the reason to play the game. The shooting is satisfying in that the enemies die quickly, and your assorted beams have different properties to play around with, like you can freeze enemies and then shatter them with a missile. But I don't know of anybody that's gonna point to Metroid Prime and say it's the best shooter ever made. Kind of a similar situation with Dark Souls. Dark Souls has serviceable combat, but on a technical level, it's not at the level of something like Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden. It's good, not great. What's alluring about Dark Souls isn't the combat, it's the build variety, enemy design, and level architecture. With Metroid Prime, the combat isn't the draw, it's the movement, exploration, progression, and level design. One of the biggest strengths of Prime 1 is the backtracking, believe it or not. Your first foray into a zone has you taking the long way around, but a repeat visit allows you to take shortcuts. You can double jump to a higher ledge or swing over pits with a grapple beam. This kind of level design is missing when you can just fast travel anywhere. The back half of Dark Souls is pretty mediocre, with you running into dead ends and needing to fast travel out, or I guess you could retrace your steps, but because you're not able to skip portions of the level with improved movement capabilities, like in Metroid, and you can't uncover secrets with powers you didn't have before, do you really want to backtrack? Is there a reason to? Another strength of Symphony of the Night is your ability to go down a corridor in several different ways. You can just walk forward, you can shield dash, once you get the double jump you can pogo off enemies, you can phase through enemies as Mist, sprint in wolf form, or wing smash as a bat. Because you have all of these options, backtracking doesn't feel repetitive. You have new powers to use and master. I received some flack for my Hollow Knight video for criticizing how movement was handled in that game. Well, I think people didn't agree with most of what I had to say about the game, but I will always stand by the movement being the weakest part of Hollow Knight. The combat is great, but if I'm playing an exploration platformer, I'm not playing for the combat. I don't play Symphony of the Night or Super Metroid because they're a masterclass in combat. I play for the exploration and platforming. That's one field that I think Silksong stands to improve significantly on, since Hornet looks to have a more aerial-focused playstyle. One thing I do at the start of every playthrough is turn off the hint system. I'm slowly coming to accept that most players just don't get certain games, and developers feel compelled to include conveniences so that more players can beat them. But I think the hint system misses the point of Metroid Prime. This is an exploration-focused game. Grabbing the boost ball power-up and remembering where you've seen half-pipes is what makes this type of level design so special. You get that aha moment where you're retracing your steps and see something new you can interact with. By placing a marker on your map, you're removing some of that sense of exploration. If you want a linear shooter, there exists plenty. I would hope that you're playing Metroid Prime because you want to get lost. Again, hypocrite, why is it okay to get lost in Metroid Prime but not Hollow Knight? I'd love to say it's because Talon 4 is easier to navigate than Hollowness, but I don't think that's completely true. The map is certainly easier to read, rooms are named, and you don't need to purchase upgrades to make the map more functional, but I do think that by being a 3D game, the environments make more sense. You're not jumping atop contrived platforms. Most parts of the environment feel like organic parts of the world. Because it's easier to make sense of these levels, I think on some level, however small, it's easier to memorize and recognize these rooms. Prime 1 kind of bombards you with mini-bosses in the Chozo Ruins, but it's not representative of how the rest of the game plays out. The game wants you to quickly recover your basic loadout, and these mini-bosses help to make these upgrades feel more significant. There exists a handful of moments where the game takes control away from the player to show a brief cutscene, either for a boss introduction, acquiring a suit upgrade, panning the camera around the environment the first time you enter an area, and sometimes guiding you to solve a puzzle. I will forever be a proponent for keeping control in the player's hands for as long as possible, and this is something I think Super Metroid accomplishes better than Prime. You don't need to show me what a new area looks like, I'm gonna explore it anyway. As the series gained new entries, Retro doubled down on moments where you're not in control. Prime 2 has moments where you need to speak with NPCs, and entering and exiting Dark Ether incurs a loading transition every time, which, I get it, that's a hardware limitation, but Prime 1 is seamless outside of the elevators, which does wonders for the pacing of exploration. If Retro ever remasters Prime 2, the portal loading is one aspect I hope they could eliminate. Then Prime 3 doubled down even harder on the cutscenes, and this is where I might lose some people. Metroid is not a story-driven series. It doesn't have rich character development or a traditional 3-act structure in terms of narrative, and it shouldn't. That's not what makes these games appealing. In my Curb Your Expectations for Metroid Prime 4 video, someone commented that I'm viewing Samus as just a power suit and not as a character, and I said yes, I agree with that. In Super Metroid, Samus speaks for 6 screens at the start of the game, and it's just to summarize the first 2 games and provide a setup for what her current mission is. Samus doesn't even utter a single word in Metroid Prime, yet people still fell in love with these games, with these worlds. We recognize Samus as a stoic badass that gets the job done. I don't know what the deal is with this compulsive desire for writers to include more dialogue, thinking a character can't be interesting or memorable unless they never stop talking. If Samus spoke her mind about how difficult this mission is and reflected on the lessons taught to her by her commander, how would that serve the gameplay? How would that make her a bigger badass? Does she need a backstory? I certainly don't think so, yet we live in a world where Other M exists. Other M is proof that a stronger emphasis on narrative doesn't make for a better Metroid. This shouldn't be taken as a challenge to write a bigger and better story than Other M. The quality of the narrative in Other M was poor, but the frequent cutscene interruptions and gameplay concessions put in place to serve that narrative were by far the largest issue. Prime 3 and Other M are more linear games because of the increased emphasis on story. Final Fantasy XIII's extreme linearity is also a result of the increased emphasis on storytelling. Notice how some of the most respected non-linear games like La Mulana and Symphony of the Night are also light on story, or in the case of System Shock, the world building is explained through optional audio logs, so as not to bog down the gameplay. You can move and listen to the story simultaneously. You don't need to have forced walking, let me move at my own pace. Metroid Prime also handles storytelling in a way that doesn't interfere with the gameplay, through the scan visor. For players interested in learning about this world, you can stop to scan as often as you like. For players that don't care, or if you replay the game a dozen times and don't feel compelled to scan everything anymore, you can skip the scanning. There's a fascinating world to uncover here. You can discover what happened to the Chozo, why the space pirates are here and what they're looking for, and why the Metroid are back. Using the scan visor is like touring a living museum. You walk around, see something interesting, scan it, and learn something new. And best of all, it's not forced. You can have Samus tour a fascinating world and tell an interesting story, and you can do it without excessive cutscenes or dialogue. Prime 1 is proof of that. The Magmoor Caverns function as a highway, from which most of the major areas branch. You revisit this zone frequently, which is why the map is linear. It's difficult to get lost down here since it serves as a transport tunnel more than anything else. It's also where you can pick up the first artifact. The artifact hunt is something a new player is likely to save for the end of the game, since 1. You probably don't know that it's mandatory, and 2. You don't know which power-ups are required to obtain each one until you physically visit that location. This ties into how the game becomes more enjoyable on a replay, because once you memorize the artifact locations, you can acquire them more organically. I'm heading down this tunnel anyway, so I might as well snag the artifact. There are many situations like this where obtaining the artifact doesn't require much backtracking. Prime 2 is a significant step back in this regard, because you can't start acquiring Sky Temple keys until you get the Dark Visor, which means playing through half the game. But an even bigger issue is that the hunt can't properly begin until you acquire the Light Suit, which is the last power-up you get. The Light Suit is required to obtain 5 out of the 9 keys. In contrast, Prime 1 only requires the final upgrade, the Phazon Suit, for 1 artifact. Playing these games for the first time, maybe this doesn't sound like much of an issue, but it's during a replay where this issue becomes more apparent. The jumping in Metroid Prime is floaty, but it's a deliberate design choice that serves the game well. Because this is a first-person game, it's difficult to gauge the distance of your jumps and where you'll land. You can't see Samus's feet when you look down, which could assist with landing, but instead of needing to awkwardly rely on tilting the camera down during every jump, Retro opted to give the players a great deal of control during jumps. Samus has enough airtime during a jump for you to correct your positioning, and the platforming is never so strict that it demands precise landing. You also obtain the space jump boots early on, which further aids in correcting your jumps. The platforming in Prime isn't challenging, it's meant to add a layer of depth to exploration. There's a lot of verticality here, and the platforming is meant to be smooth, not frustrating. The punishment for missing a jump is also never severe. There are no instant death spikes or inescapable pits where you can lose 10 minutes of progress. Your punishment in the Chozo ruins is acidic water, which slowly depletes your health. In the Magmoor Caverns, the lava depletes your health a bit faster. Once you reach the Phazon mines, the Phazon depletes it even faster, which is why the Phazon suit is required to obtain the last artifact. Most of the time, you can use your health as a resource to purposefully wade through these hazardous areas as a shortcut. Phendrana is the point where new players are prone to get stuck, and I imagine this is where Retro decided to implement the hint system, probably during playtesting. Until this point, the game has been fairly linear. The slice of the Talon overworld you can access is limited, the Chozo ruins has straightforward progression, and the Magmoor Caverns brought you here, so you can assume that this is the next major area. But the game wants you to leave and then return to Phendrana, not once, but twice. You'll acquire the boost ball early on, and I think it's reasonable for a player to assume that he needs to use it to proceed deeper into this region. After all, the Chozo ruins didn't ask you to return to the Talon overworld as part of progression. However, you need to return to the overworld and acquire the space jump boots before continuing onward. And the only hint you get is a shadow of Ridley flying in that direction. Some players might think this is difficult to figure out, but this shouldn't be a reach. You've come across several half-pipes on your way here, and even if you don't remember the one in Talon, surely you remember the one in the Chozo ruins, right? And if not, you know this much: you've got a new power-up, and you've been taught how to use it. So, backtrack, and look for places where you can apply this power-up. That's how Metroid works. That's the appeal of this series. Certain entries like Fusion and Other M push the linearity so far that they lose sight of what makes these games so appealing. Even Zero Mission, which I enjoy quite a bit, forces objective markers on you. You are required to interact with Chozo statues as part of progression, and they place waypoints on your map. At the very least, you can turn off the hints in Prime 1, but some of the games in this series have zero faith in the player, and don't even afford you this option. I dread the day when we get a Super Metroid remake, and the developers smear the map with hints and objective markers. Once you return to Phendrana, you acquire the Wave Beam, which brings a slew of practical applications. The most obvious is that it opens purple doors, but as we'll discover, it also activates switches to power doors, and a charge shot can temporarily stun enemies. I quite like the weapon variety in this game. There aren't many, but that also means there isn't much redundancy. Later on, you've got the Ice Beam, color-coded enemies appear to force you to switch between weapons, the Chozo ghosts have to be fought with a power beam, and the final boss shifts its weakness. It's one thing to provide a player with tools and tell him that he can choose when to use them, and another to force him. I think there's benefits for both approaches. In a game like Thief, you can use water arrows to put out flames and then hide in the shadows. You can use moss arrows to create silent walking surfaces. You've got flares, lockpicks, invisibility potions, and other assorted tools that aid you in sneaking in or creating distractions. But you're not forced to use all of these tools, or any of them. You can always just study the enemy behavior and slowly maneuver around them. No tools required. The tools allow you to approach each situation in a different way. Without them, the appeal of Thief, finding your own way in, would be lost. Metroid Prime has strict keys that must be used to unlock the doors it puts in your way, but for combat, you're afforded a more flexible approach. I remember being stingy with missiles during my first playthrough and wondering why enemies felt spongy. You're intended to use missiles liberally. It feels like a limited resource, but it isn't, and by the time you get the Wave Beam and Ice Beam, you can stun enemies and fire off a missile or two to quickly deal with them. Once you snag the super missiles, that's when ammo can become scarce. But I like how you fire off the super missiles. In Super Metroid, super missiles were a distinct ammo type, and you needed to toggle between regular and super missiles. Prime just subtracts 5 regular missiles from your stock instead of 1, so there's no need to clog the interface with another toggle. It's also better this way from a control perspective. You just charge a shot and then fire off a missile at max charge, so it's impossible to accidentally fire these off. This segment after acquiring the thermal visor is made worse in the remastered version, because beam lighting was removed. In the original GameCube version, the beams produced an illumination effect as the shots traveled across the room. The Wave Beam was useful here because this segment takes place in almost complete darkness, so your shots would produce this beautiful lighting effect that guided you through the rooms. But more than that, it was attention to detail. Yeah, it's something minor, but when you take several of these minor things and add them up, you get a collection of great things. The Ice Beam produces a frost effect at the end of the barrel, water runs down the armed cannon when you're standing in the rain, and beams illuminated dark corridors. The reason this dynamic lighting was removed was because of frame rate concerns. There's a great interview with the technical engineer for the original release of Metroid Prime, where he explains what happened. The Nintendo Switch renders light differently compared to the GameCube, because it's powered by a mobile chip. With mobile hardware, there isn't room to run many shaders at once, so this type of lighting had to be removed to maintain a stable frame rate, since other aspects of art design like environmental lighting were more taxing. Though I like the Switch overall, I've come to grow a bit disappointed with it. The port of Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door runs at half the frame rate of the original, because unlike Retro Studios, that team opted to sacrifice performance in favor of stronger visuals. We're getting gorgeous ports of these classic GameCube games, which I'm glad more people can experience, but I can't really call them the definitive versions. Even something like Xenoblade, which has a snazzy new post-game and revamped art style, lost some of the charm of the original's unique art, and that's something where I wish the developers included a toggle to switch between art styles. There's a port of Radiant Historia for the 3DS that also went with the new art style, but Atlus decided to charge $3 to use the original DS portraits. The port already costs more than the original, so charging even more just to use the older art didn't make sense to me, and it still doesn't. Thardis is a boss that I hated to fight until I learned the trick. The scan visor can be used on every boss to help you determine their weakness, which kind of spoils the fights, but it doesn't tell you the trick to making Thardis more bearable. Ordinarily, you'd use the thermal visor to locate his weak point. What the scan visor doesn't tell you is that your morph ball bombs can also expose his weak point. I still think this boss has a bit too much health for what's ultimately a straightforward fight. Your reward is the Spider Ball, and before you can complete Phendrana, you need to grab the Ice Beam. The game makes it a bit more obvious that you need to leave because the exit to Magamore is right outside the boss room. Much like acquiring the boost ball, you're expected to remember where you've seen spider tracks throughout your exploration. At least these are more immediately recognizable than the half-pipes you can use the boost ball on. The remastered version of Prime offers plenty of control types, and as an advocate for motion controls, I have to say I'm a bit disappointed here. Prime on the Wii controlled beautifully because the Wiimote directed your shots exactly where you wanted them. Prime on the GameCube and Switch are still fantastic games that control well, but naturally, because the Switch doesn't come with a sensor bar, it can't match the controls of the Wii. The substitute here is gyro aiming, which is lackluster. The sensor isn't as accurate as the Wiimote, which uses an infrared camera, and if you played the Mario Galaxy port on the Switch, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The gyro aiming is serviceable, but it isn't great. You need to reset your aim frequently because the sensors can't track a reference point like a camera can. This remastered port introduces a dual stick layout that makes it control like a modern shooter, which is fine. Jumping is naturally mapped to the L button, so you don't need to move your thumbs off the sticks to jump, aim, and shoot simultaneously. But because you're sacrificing that second stick to control the camera, you can no longer quickly swap between beam types. The GameCube version used the C stick to switch between beams, and you can still use that classic layout in this remastered port, so there are plenty of options to accommodate players that have specific preferences. There's a Dolphin emulator fork called Prime Hack that is specifically designed to enhance the Prime trilogy, and it allows for mouse-look controls. With graphics mods, you could probably get the game to look close enough to this remastered version, but with superior controls. It's unfortunate that the game industry is designed so that pirates get the superior experience, and this is especially evident when games on Steam come with kernel-level anti-cheat, which pirated versions remove. What I find especially egregious is Nintendo's pricing of this port. The Prime Trilogy released on the Wii with enhanced controls and a steelbook case for $50. This port of Prime 1 cost $40. The new visuals are gorgeous, but mechanically, this is the same game from 2002, which is perfect. That's what I wanted. I don't want it changed. I don't want a remake. But because this is just a visual facelift, the exorbitant pricing doesn't feel justified. Nintendo released a port of Donkey Kong Country Returns, which was available on the Wii and 3DS, and they're charging $60 for it on the Switch. Nintendo, much like Apple, believes that charging a premium for their products is a sign of quality. They don't want to devalue their brand by releasing reasonably priced products, hence the $100 alarm clock. What Nintendo doesn't seem to understand is that they used to have Player's Choice and Nintendo Selects labeled games. For $20, you could buy some of the greatest games ever produced, like Metroid Prime and Super Mario Galaxy. Nobody thinks less of these games because they were released at a cheaper price. Pricing in this industry has gotten out of hand. I'm not sure if anyone else thinks this way, but when did indie devs get the nerve to charge $35 or $40 for their games? Doesn't that seem a bit outrageous? I couldn't believe that Bomb Rush Cyberpunk launched at $40, Sea of Stars $35. I'm not denying that creating games requires a great deal of effort, but this is a far cry from the days where you could get The Binding of Isaac for $5, or Minecraft for €10 during alpha. Nowadays, you can find games comprised solely of store-bought assets, where the store page will proudly tout that it's a solo dev project, and the pricing is over $15. I guess when you step back and look at how out of control pricing has become, Nintendo charging $40 for Metroid Prime doesn't seem so bad. Your next key item is the Ice Beam, and it's here where I made a pretty significant mistake the first time I played through the game. There's an exit nearby that leads to the Talon Overworld, and armed with your suite of new power-ups, you might find it tempting to use your Ice Beam to enter the crashed frigate. The game deposited you at its doorstep after all, so why not? There's a save point in the crashed frigate, and the room right past that save point requires the gravity suit to progress. If you made the mistake of saving down there, you get to contend with the arduous process of climbing out. In retrospect, I feel like an idiot. Knowing what I know now about the series, I wouldn't venture too deep into an underwater area without the gravity suit. But since this was my first Metroid, I didn't know that such a power-up existed. A player being able to make a mistake like this isn't too common with modern games. It'd be considered a faux pas for a developer to trap a player into this situation. Was it frustrating getting stuck down there? Of course, but it's a valuable lesson, and it's a memorable moment that I had playing the game. When Sekiro released, There was an initial fear that dying too much could permanently kill merchant NPCs and make the game even more difficult. Of course, this wasn't the case at all. Dragon Rot temporarily stops quest progression related to afflicted NPCs until you cure it. Not even FromSoft would dare to be that cruel. Another example of developers losing faith in modern gamers can be seen with the Elder Scrolls series. In Morrowind, you could kill essential NPCs, and the game would warn you that you just made the game extremely difficult to complete. This changed with Oblivion, where any story-relevant NPCs could no longer be killed. This doesn't affect most players, who probably wouldn't go out of their way to kill random NPCs unprovoked, but for role-playing purposes, these modern Bethesda RPGs feel like a humongous step back from Morrowind. If you played the game, you probably noticed times where Samus will immediately unmorph from her morph ball form without going through her standing animation. This is an intentional feature. If you exit morph ball form in areas where there's an obstruction, either a wall or enemy that stops the camera from zooming in, the game will immediately unmorph Samus and switch back to the first-person view. This is done so that the camera doesn't need to awkwardly phase through solid matter. Oftentimes in third-person games, when the player is obstructed by the environment, the objects in the foreground will turn transparent so that you can still see your character. Unless you're playing a FromSoft game, in which case the camera will just zoom in and completely block your view of the action. In Metroid Prime 2, you can also perform instant morphs. That is, you can skip the animation where Samus enters morph ball form, and it's really easy to do. Just jump into a door frame. All three Prime games have cool speedrunning tricks that are easy to perform. You can kill the final boss in Prime 2 in a few seconds by jumping into him with a screw attack. This was a developer oversight that was patched in the Wii version. On one hand, it's understandable that devs want to address these kinds of issues. It's not rewarding to cheese a final boss to such an extreme extent. On the other, fixing these tricks and making sequence breaking more difficult takes away from some of the replay value. In the PS2 version of Tales of the Abyss, there's a trick you can perform to permanently unlock a playable character that you shouldn't be able to permanently have, which was patched out in the 3DS port. Just because a game isn't functioning the way the developers intended, doesn't necessarily mean the game is made worse. Starting with Metroid Prime 3, the Prime series incorporated the ability to jump while in morph ball form instead of relying on bomb jumping, which is called Spring Ball. The Wii ports of Prime 1 and 2 retroactively included Spring Ball, which is a change I'm conflicted about. I do appreciate how movement is made more fluid, because now you don't need to stop and wait for a bomb to explode to gain height, you can just jump. But many of these platforming sections were designed with bomb jumping in mind. Mastering the bomb jump rewarded you with missile expansions and energy tanks. Now that you can Spring Ball, you're not tested on your ability to chain bomb jumps outside of sequence breaking. Bomb jumping in Prime was never particularly powerful to begin with. In games like Super Metroid and Zero Mission, chaining bomb jumps was an extremely important skill to master, and it allowed for some impressive sequence breaks, especially once you were able to nail down horizontal bomb jumps. The Prime trilogy limits your ability to lay down multiple bombs, and the refill timer is set so that you can't chain bomb jumps infinitely. We've already established that Retro has a distaste for sequence breaking, so it's likely that the bomb jump restriction was designed to minimize this. If there's one thing I dislike about the Prime trilogy, it's that Retro was too fearful of players breaking their game. The beauty of Super Metroid is finding out that wall jumps exist, yet the game is designed so that you don't need to use it. So why does it exist? To reward players that put in the effort to learn how to apply it. Climbing shafts is faster, you can reach areas you weren't meant to access early on, and by extension, make the game more difficult. Playing the game the intended way is easy. Sequence breaking makes it more challenging. It's a dynamic difficulty select, where the better you get at the game, the more difficult it can become, and your reward is a faster clear time. With the Gravity Suit, we can finally explore the crashed frigate, where my favorite song in the game plays. Retro is an American developer, but the composer for this game was Kenji Yamamoto, who worked on the Metroid series since Super Metroid. I really appreciate bringing him back on board for Metroid Prime. The series jumping to 3D was going to be a big hurdle to overcome for longtime fans, so having familiar sounding music would help players feel more at ease. A good test for the quality of a soundtrack is being able to determine which media that music comes from just from listening to any track for a few seconds. Having a cohesive sound profile is just as important as each song being good individually. For example, with the Indiana Jones series, It shouldn't be too difficult to determine which music comes from Temple of Doom, since John Williams composed more sinister sounding, aggressive tracks for that film. Even if you don't remember the song exactly, you can link the song with the movie, because it has a distinct feel to it. This is a problem Falcom has been facing in recent years. When a composer submits a track, Falcom will either approve or deny that track. If it's denied, it goes in the backlog, and they can pull that song out many years later and use it for a game that it very clearly wasn't composed for. And it can be very jarring to hear a sudden shift in quality between tracks. Even if a song, taken on its own, sounds fantastic, it might not be applied in a fitting way. How could it be if the composer of the track hasn't even worked at the company for years? Now we enter the Phazon Mines, which has an increased emphasis on action, which is better served by the more linear structure of the zone. You can't easily get lost down here, because the focus shifts from exploration to action. You start fighting mid-bosses like these elite pirates. There are turrets that can easily wipe your health bars if you try to boost ball past them while on low health, killing your entire playthrough because you were racing through the game without saving just to record footage for a video, so there goes 2.5 hours flushed down the toilet. From a lore perspective, this is by far the most interesting locale on the planet, since it explains why the space pirates are here. You'll learn more if you scan the pirate entries on the computers, but the environmental storytelling here does an admirable job by itself. You've come across several space pirates by this point, but it's not until you reach the Phazon Mines where you'll feel like you're intruding on their turf. The entrance to the mines is filled with computers and mining equipment, and it's where most of the space pirates congregate. But as you move deeper within the mines, the spacious rooms are replaced with dark tunnels, the Phazon itself becomes an environmental hazard, Metroids become the primary enemy, and the boss is a pirate that's juiced up on so much Phazon that he just falls on Samus and corrupts her suit. But the Phazon Mines are not just a straight shot through to the end. Your first visit is just to grab the power bombs and grapple beam, and you use these tools to acquire the X-ray visor and plasma beam through some light backtracking, and it's only once you've gotten this complete loadout when you can finally kill the Omega Pirate. With the Phazon suit, you can snag the last artifact. I acquired the remaining in between visits to the Phazon Mines. The only region where acquiring artifacts requires a significant amount of backtracking are the ones in Phendrana, since they require the plasma beam and power bombs to acquire. The two in Talon are free. You can acquire them the first time you visit their respective rooms. The two in Magmor are acquired early on, you just need missiles and space jump. The three in the Chozo Ruins are obtained in waves, but you pass through there frequently enough for it to not be an issue. And the last two are in the Phazon Mines, and they can be acquired during your second visit. But once you kill the Omega Pirate and acquire that last artifact, which is in a nearby room, you can proceed to the endgame. If this were designed like Prime 2, acquiring the Phazon suit would signal the point where you can finally start collecting most of the artifacts. Backtracking in Prime 2 isn't too time-consuming since the levels are structured around the central hub, but it's disappointing to see that something as simple as the artifact hunt wasn't improved. It was made worse. It's times like this where I appreciate the simplicity of Super Metroid. Once the major bosses are killed, you go directly to Turian. The pacing is preserved. You don't need to grab an arbitrary number of items just to open a door. The build-up for the Ridley fight is pretty tame, and traditionally most fights against Ridley are anticlimactic, except for Other M. In Other M, Samus sees Ridley and freezes up in fear, so Ridley grabs her and rips off her power suit and tosses her around. And it's this big Hollywood build-up with a dramatic cutscene for what's yet again a straightforward fight. It's really hard to put into words how much I despise Other M for simultaneously turning Samus into a character and then assassinating her. And I can't blame Team Ninja. Team Ninja didn't write the story or come up with the concept. That was all Yoshio Sakamoto, the man who directed Super Metroid, and how he decided that Metroid needed more story is beyond me. When Fusion came out, one of the biggest complaints leveraged at it was the linearity, which was a direct result of the increased focus on storytelling. I've seen Metroid Fusion receive more praise in recent years, when really, it's almost a prototype for Other M, and the last thing we need is for people to reappraise Other M as a misunderstood masterpiece, when it's still just a really bad Metroid. Once Ridley's down, you've got one final platforming challenge before confronting Metroid Prime. The endings for these Prime games became progressively more intense, with Prime 2 pitting you against Dark Samus during the escape sequence, so you're put on a clock. Prime 3 has you fight against a final boss gauntlet with a constantly draining health bar. But there's no pressure in Prime 1. It's a simple climb in a large room, with a handful of Metroids sprinkled throughout to pester you. I don't want to come across as a hipster and say Prime 1 had a better ending sequence because it's a quiet moment to reflect on your journey, because I don't believe that at all. I think Prime 2 probably had the best ending, because Dark Samus was such a great rival. You knew this final fight was coming, you've already confronted Dark Samus several times, and the game has you going for a second. You kill who you presume is the final boss, and while you race to get out, Dark Samus appears for one final showdown. Yeah, it's more Hollywood, but I'm a sucker for a good action flick. The final boss of Prime 1 is broken into two phases. The first tests your ability to switch between beams, but it's not too different from fighting pirates in the Phazon mines. In fact, it's easier because you've only got one target. The difficulty tries to escalate throughout the fight, and it does so by providing you with less safe zones to hide in when Metroid Prime charges across the screen. But this technique isn't really effective, so the fight feels protracted, just a ton of health to whittle away, which is made worse on hard mode. Phase 2 is a victory lap. You just wait for the boss to create puddles of Phazon, switch between visors until you locate the boss, then fire away. This hyper mode attack is something that's also further developed in Prime 3. The Prime series would progressively become much better in terms of combat, but at the detriment of exploration. I don't have a lot of praise to sing about Prime 1 in regards to its combat, because combat isn't the draw. The shooting is serviceable, but that's not to be taken as a negative, because the simplistic combat means exploration is smooth and uninhibited. With Prime 2, there's light and dark ammo, and while this creates an engaging loop of killing dark enemies with light ammo and vice versa, it also means you can find yourself without an effective means to attack if you run out of ammo. And there are also light and dark doors, so if you run out of ammo, you can no longer progress through the level. So while the enemy encounters are more challenging and strategic, it's to the detriment of exploration. But on a replay, you can learn when to conserve ammo, so the game does feel more rewarding to play on subsequent runs. It's a game with more strategic combat, and that might be why players prefer it to Prime 1. It's a game I should prefer to Prime 1, but the ease of replaying Prime 1 makes it my go-to game when I'm in a Metroid mood. I went into this playthrough wanting to analyze why I love Metroid Prime so much, and in the process I think I became too distracted, going on unrelated tangents. I'm not sure how much of my passion for this game came through, but it's not often when I'll find a game I can play through 20 times and not get bored. I think that statement alone speaks more than anything else I've said. I see people sink thousands of hours into MMOs, or in the case of speedrunners, they may sink tens of thousands of hours into one game, perfecting their runs. That kind of dedication for any one game is something I can't relate with, and in comparison, my playtime in Metroid Prime is nothing. I spent longer on a single playthrough of a mediocre RPG, but I think there's something special about being able to still find appreciation for a game after 20 years of playing it. Metroid is a fantastic series, but I don't think we'll see the series return to the formula we saw in Super Metroid and Metroid Prime 1. These games weren't afraid to be games. It's hard to put into words what I mean by that, it's more of a feeling. When I boot up Super Metroid, I'm just playing the game. There aren't waypoints or quest markers, I'm not pushing forward to see how the story unfolds. It's a game about exploration, and it sticks to that design philosophy from start to finish. There's no Zero Suit segment where you need to avoid enemies, you don't need to return to a hub and speak with an NPC to advance the story, the combat doesn't evolve, it's a focused game. Metroid Prime 1 was an attempt to translate that experience in 3D, and for the most part, it succeeds. I'd even go as far to say that the passage of time has only made these games better. Would I appreciate Prime 1 if we received 10 sequels in the exact same style? Probably not. The fact that the gaming landscape has changed dramatically over the decades, that modern games are designed for modern tastes, makes me appreciate these older games more. With this entire video's worth of preamble out of the way, hopefully you can understand my perspective when I say I'm not excited for Metroid Prime 4. Retro Studios has a consistently great track record. I have no doubt Metroid Prime 4 will be a good game, but will it be something I play for the 20th time 20 years from now? Will it be something special? I don't know. I want it to be nothing short of incredible, but my tastes don't line up with what the current market craves. For Metroid Prime 4 to be something I love, it would need to be something the modern industry deems archaic or outdated. It would need to unapologetically be a video game, and I just don't see that happening. I hope I'm wrong, but even if I'm not, if we can all just enjoy a quality Metroid game, that would be good enough. Metroid isn't a huge money printer for Nintendo, so I'm glad they're even allowing newer games to be made. It would be very easy to leave it rotting in the past like F-Zero. Now with the Switch 2 on the way, we're getting yet another Mario Kart, and it's getting more difficult to muster any enthusiasm for the future of Nintendo. I love the games this company has produced. I even love their modern stuff like Tears of the Kingdom and Pikmin 4. But seeing yet another Mario Kart being used as the game Nintendo's waving around to advertise their new system? Anyway, Metroid Prime is amazing. Give it a whirl if you haven't yet, and turn off the hints while you're at it. This is a once-in-a-decade game, and hopefully the newer generations will find some appreciation for it, both today and in another 20 years.